Hey, Saiko! You ready to have some fun? Let's review Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. The game starts off with a fun recreation of the opening sequence of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's a nice way to ease into the gameplay while hitting you right in the nostalgic feels. It's pretty cool to see some of those iconic moments recreated in game form. The sequence ends by cutting to Indy suddenly waking up at his desk back in his college office. The year is 1937, which is about 1 year after the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And apparently Indy has stress dreams about being crushed by that large boulder. I guess surviving something like that can leave you with a little PTSD. After getting up, Indy hears some footsteps in the hallway just outside his door and begins to investigate. Following a trail of muddy footsteps, he encounters none other than Candyman. Candyman proceeds to beat up and then knock Indy out. And when he comes to, he discovers that his favorite statue, a cat mummy, has been taken. But why does Candyman want the cat mummy? And why was he so ginormously tall?
Why, Black Dynamite? Why?
Well, to find those answers and more, Indy sets off on a worldwide adventure. He meets up with that guy from Galaxy Quest and teams up with Not Marion, a journalist looking for her missing sister. Eventually he uncovers an evil plot led by none other than history's most infamous villains, the Nazis.
Nazis!
Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is very much a cinematic action-adventure style of game. Even though it plays mostly through first-person perspective, it has a lot more in common with games like Uncharted and Tomb Raider than anything like Call of Duty. The majority of the gameplay can be divided into 3 buckets: exploration, puzzles, and combat. A large part of the game is spent walking around the world, talking to different characters, and gathering clues and evidence to further the story. While these segments of the game don't involve that much gameplay, the devs did take an interesting approach to make even the most mundane tasks playable. For instance, there's almost a mini-game you have to play just to open doors. First you have to hit the action button to grab the doorknob, and then hit another button or direction key to twist the knob and pop the door open. If the door is locked, you have to hit a button to take out the key, another one to insert the key into the lock, and then finally hit another button to twist the key, unlock the door, and open it. The same goes for treasure chests.
Son of a bitch!
It's an interesting way to keep us playing all aspects of the game, even when simply opening doors or chests. The same logic applies to many of the in-game cutscenes. Instead of just sitting back and watching the story unfold, there are often breaks in the scene where you have to execute a small action to continue the story. I wouldn't say these little gaming elements were 100% successful. Sometimes I just wanted to open a door with a single click, but I do like the attempt to keep all aspects of the game engaging. The puzzles are where I believe the game shines the most. They're fun and interesting, and to solve them you have to leverage all the different play mechanics the game has to offer. They really give you that feeling of being Indiana Jones and exploring ancient tombs, trying to unlock their mysteries while staying alive. Most of the puzzles involve being locked in a room or blocked from moving forward by some big door until it's solved and things open up. But there are some segments where I consider simply traversing the world successfully as being a puzzle in and of itself. It's not always obvious the best way to climb up a wall or make it to some entry point, and so figuring out the best path forward in those situations also adds to the problem-solving, puzzly nature of the game. I have mixed feelings about the combat in the game. I think it's interesting that they chose to keep melee combat in first person. The camera doesn't pull back when you run up and punch a guy, not even when you attack using your whip. And I think that's cool, and I think it was executed rather well. The punches feel like they have weight, and the crack of the whip sounds great. The problem I have is Indiana Jones as a character, while being a decent brawler, isn't known for being a gun-wielding super soldier like Rambo, nor some gung-fu supermaster like Bruce Lee. And to their credit, the creators of the game knew this too, which means while the game has this pretty effective combat system, you're not really incentivized to use it.
No way.
If you go hog wild and start shooting up the place, you're going to quickly get overwhelmed and killed. So the only way to make it through areas packed with bad guys is to ignore the melee system almost entirely and just duck walk across the levels, avoiding confrontation. But if you do want to have a little beat 'em up fun, the best way is to sneak up behind an enemy and knock them out in one click. And that's mostly what I did in every combat situation. Sneaked up and knocked them out. Over and over. What I find funny is that with one click of a button, I can make Indy knock out a Nazi in a variety of different and sometimes elaborate ways. But to open a frickin' door, I need to click buttons like a madman? To be clear, I'm not against adding playability to opening a door. But because the majority of combat relies on stealth, why not make stealth knockouts require more input than just sneaking up and clicking a button? They could have had the different styles of takedowns require different sequences of buttons. They could have also set a time limit in which to execute them. Then instant knockouts would have to be played and they'd have to be earned. It would have given the risk-reward ratio of these combat encounters a much needed kick in the butt. Before I move on from combat, I do want to mention that there are a handful of moments where stealth is not only not encouraged, but it's not even allowed. Occasionally, the plot will throw Indy and not Marion in some truly epic action set pieces. During those moments, Indiana Jones and crew usually have to blast their way out of chaos, and stealth or subtlety don't fly. Those segments are as fun to play as they are visually impressive to watch. I couldn't talk about an Indiana Jones action-adventure game without talking about the whip. The whip is as iconic to Indy as is his fedora, and with The Great Circle being a first-person action game, many people wondered how it would feel to use his whip in-game. In fact, I know there were those who felt it was a mistake to use the first-person perspective, particularly because of the whip. Now mind you, I didn't feel that way. I like it when creators take risks and try to think outside the box. Making a Tomb Raider style third-person action game would be the obvious way to make a new Indiana Jones game. But going first person? That takes guts, that takes skills, and if done right, it could be great. Well, I'm happy to say they did it right. It's like when I first played Harry Potter Legacy and it was immediately clear that the devs nailed that perfect feel of casting spells. The whip feels good, it feels powerful, and it feels like an extension of Indy. For combat with the whip, the camera stays in first person, but it does pull back to third person whenever you're using the whip to swing across a gap or climb up a wall. And you know what? That's okay. It's a perfect compromise. Trying to navigate a swing and a jump or climbing up a tall wall wouldn't be as easy or look as cinematic if the camera stayed in first person. That being said, my favorite whip moment in the game was in first person. Indy and not Marion were confronted by a sword-wielding soldier bent on slicing and dicing them up. It seems the scene was meant to be an homage to a similar moment in Raiders of the Lost Ark. But because, as I mentioned before, combat in the game rarely had me use Indy's gun, I totally forgot he even had one. So instead, I ran away and started whipping the guy repeatedly in the face. When that didn't work, I ran up to the guy and tried to knock him out with some fisticuffs. But that didn't work either. So I ran backwards a little more and jumped the gap I had previously crossed. And when the soldier attempted to follow me across the gap, I cracked the whip across his face, interrupting his momentum, and boom, down the gap he fell to his demise. It was hilarious and awesome. If you've seen screenshots or gameplay of The Great Circle, then you already know that it looks great. The environments are beautifully rendered and packed with all manner of details that make them fun to explore and get lost in. Now, I kind of feel bad saying this, but even though the game does look pretty amazing, this is the level of graphical goodness one would expect in a modern game from a AAA studio. I know it still takes a lot of work and talent to pull off these visuals, so I don't want to downplay that, but the industry as a whole has solved the riddle of making high-def humanoid characters look good and perform well. Long gone are the days of Resident Evil level bad animations and character performances.
Jill, no. You don't want to go back out there.
But we've got to find...
What was that?
Chris?
No.
Fortunately, The Great Circle does have a few tricks up its sleeve to set itself apart from other great-looking games out there, and key among them is the man himself, Indiana Jones. I think it's safe to say that the devs of The Great Circle had a lot riding on their ability to bring Indiana Jones to life in digital form. Fortunately for us and them and the lore, I think they did a fantastic job. To start things off, the character model looks just like Indy after Raiders of the Lost Ark. He looks great standing still and in motion and never crosses the dreaded uncanny valley. Then comes the mocap acting and animations that bring him to life. They did a really great job of capturing his movements and mannerisms, even some of the more subtle ones like his smirk. And finally, to put the perfect cherry on top of this indie sundae, they cast one Mr. Troy Baker, probably best known as the voice of Joel from The Last of Us, as the voice of Indy. And oh boy oh man, he gives a terrific performance. When playing the game, I didn't see some video game character running about. I also didn't see a Harrison Ford look-alike. I saw and heard Indiana Jones, and it was awesome. It's generally accepted that a hero is only as good as their villain. A good villain tests the hero, pushes them to their limit, and makes their eventual win all the more satisfying. That's why Superman has Lex Luthor and Batman has the Joker. Well, the devs of the Great Circle knew this truth and did not disappoint when they chose their main villain to be Emmerich Voss. He's an original character created for the game, and he's the lead Nazi in charge. Like Indy, he's a trained archaeologist, but unlike Indy, he wants to unlock the mysteries of the ancient world for his own dastardly deeds and not to educate the world and preserve the past. He's basically a bizarro Indy.
Like Bizarro Superman. Superman's exact opposite. Who lives in the backwards Bizarro world.
He is the quintessential bad guy that you love to hate but can't get enough of. I think his design is fantastic, even almost iconic, and it fits perfectly within the Indy universe. His mannerisms are unique and interesting, and his personality ranges from menacing to humorous and everything in between. And he's brought expertly to life with the voice performance of Marios Gavrilis. The game hints at a long-held antagonistic relationship between Indy and Voss, and I'm kinda hoping the devs have plans to create a game that explores the circumstances of their first meeting. I think it would be fun to have them face off for the first time. It could even be a DLC. Before I move on to my score and final thoughts, I do want to shout out one more character that appears in the game. He doesn't get the most in-game screen time, but his character is vital to the story. In-game his name is Locus, but I've been referring to him as Candyman because he's performed by none other than Candyman veteran and horror icon, Tony Todd. He's a classically trained actor with a filmography that spans over 38 years and started with his first film in 1986. I grew up knowing him as the Candyman, and later as Mr. Bloodworth of the Final Destination series. To many fans, he's a horror icon, and I totally agree. He'll be forever etched into its legacy. But his library of work showcases a talent that expands all genres. In fact, one of my favorite roles he played was as the adult version of Jake Sisko in a Season 4 episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine titled The Visitor. If you ever wanted to have your heartstrings tugged every which way, give it a watch. It's a standalone episode, so it doesn't require having seen any Star Trek to keep up with the story. I wanted to shout him out, not only because he gave an excellent performance in the game, but last year in November 2024, Tony Todd passed away. He died just 1 month before Indiana Jones and the Great Circle released in the following December. It's sad to see he never got to see the game released, nor the critical acclaim the game and his performance received, but he will be remembered by me and his many fans across the world for years to come. Thank you, Tony Todd, for all the joy and frights you gave us. Rest in peace. Before I give y'all my score, I must confess, I'm not really a fan of cinematic movie-style games. In my opinion, a game should be a game first and foremost. Story, cutscenes, cinematics, even graphics, all those are secondary to the gameplay loop. So if I were to skip every cutscene and ignore the story entirely, would the gameplay alone of the Great Circle carry me through? The puzzles were fun, but I would have liked more of them. Moving around the world and climbing ledges and swinging around with the whip was great, but again, I would have liked more places to explore and whip through. And finally, the combat, while solid and well implemented, was repetitive. Other than a handful of some amazing action set pieces, the combat consisted mostly of duck, sneak, and whack. With all that being said, I'm giving Indiana Jones and the Great Circle a 3.5. 3 points are for gameplay, and I'm giving the extra 0.5 for the story and the fantastic performances of Indiana Jones, Emmerich Voss, Locus, and the rest of the crew. And just to clarify, the 0.5 is because they did a really great job with the story and the delivery. If it was a lame and boring story or bad acting, I would have just ignored it and given the game a 3. So, by my scale, pushing the score up to 3.5 is definitely a compliment to the story. The same way I wouldn't give the Blu-ray of Raiders of the Lost Ark a 5 out of 5 because the gameplay consists of hitting one button and then watching a brilliant 2-hour cutscene, I'm not going to give a game a high score just because it has a great story and cinematics. I won't do it. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is an interesting game to recommend. If you're an action game enthusiast, I'm not sure there's enough action to keep you interested. And if you're a puzzle game connoisseur, I feel the puzzles might not be puzzly enough for you, nor are there enough to satisfy. So who is this game truly for? I think if you consider yourself a gamer and a fan of Indiana Jones, then 100% it's worth your time. I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. Or if you generally like cinematic games with engaging stories and fun characters, then you'll probably like this one too. But I think the best thing this game does is it adds a compelling and genuinely fun new adventure to the Indiana Jones canon. IGN recently opined that older franchises like Indiana Jones could find new life and live on with these types of games. It may not be a perfect game, but it definitely captures the spirit and excitement and joy of the Indiana Jones franchise. And I do hope this team gets to put on the fedora one more time.